January 31st, 1943. The Tunisian desert fell silent. A German panzer commander stood frozen in his cupola, scanning the empty road ahead, where the Americans were supposed to appear. But something felt wrong. The wind had stopped. No birds, no engine noise. Just the metallic click of cooling steel and sand sliding down the dunes. Then he saw it, dust rising behind them. Not from the east where they expected the enemy, from the west, from the hills they just passed. By the time he understood what was happening, the first American shells were already screaming through the air. The hunters had become the hunted, and the man who had studied Rommel's every battle was about to teach the Desert Fox his own lesson with American efficiency. This is the story of how a legendary general was defeated by his own tactics, stolen, studied, and perfected by the one man who understood him better than he understood himself. January 31st, 1943, somewhere in the jagged hills west of Fide Pass, Tunisia, the air tasted of burned diesel and dust. A Panzer III commander stood in his cupola, field glasses pressed to his wind-burned face, scanning the ridgeline. The sun was sinking behind the Dorsal Mountains, casting long, copper shadows across the valley floor. His tank had been idling for 20 minutes, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. Around him, the rest of the company sat in loose formation. Turrets angled toward the east, waiting for the American column they'd been told was coming down Route 13. But the road was empty, and in the silence, something felt wrong. The commander lowered his glasses. The wind had stopped. No birds, no engine noise in the distance. Just the faint metallic click of cooling steel and the soft hiss of sand sliding down the dunes. He turned to his gunner and said something in German, a joke perhaps, about American cowardice, but the words died in his throat when he saw the dust rising behind them. Not from the east, from the west, from the hills they'd just passed. By the time he understood what was happening, the first American shells were already screaming through the air. This moment, this precise instant when German tank commanders realized they were the ones being hunted, marked something far more significant than a tactical reversal in North Africa. It represented the collision of two philosophies of war, two men who had studied the same ground, read the same terrain, and arrived at opposite conclusions about what the desert could teach those willing to listen. Erwin Rommel had turned North Africa into his classroom. For 2 years, he had written the curriculum in sand and blood, teaching the British Empire painful lessons about speed, deception, and the art of appearing where the enemy least expected. His Africa Corps had become legendary not for their numbers, they were always outnumbered, but for their unpredictability. Rommel understood something fundamental about desert warfare that eluded his opponents. The desert had no front lines, no natural defenses, no cities to anchor a position. It was an ocean of sand where the only advantage was movement, and the only protection was staying one step ahead of your enemy's understanding. He had refined this philosophy through dozens of engagements. At Tobruk, at Gaza, LA, at countless unnamed coordinates across Libya and Egypt, Rommel had demonstrated that conventional thinking was a death sentence in the desert. While British commanders tried to establish defensive positions and hold ground, Rommel flowed around them like water, striking supply lines, isolating strong points, vanishing into the empty quarter before the counterattack could be organized. His soldiers called it the Desert Waltz, a constant dance of advance and withdrawal, feint and strike, that left the enemy exhausted and confused. The British had learned slowly and painfully to respect this method. By 1942, Bernard Montgomery had arrived in Egypt with a determination to match Rommel's mobility with superior resources and methodical planning. El Alamein became the proving ground for this approach, Montgomery's set-piece battle that finally halted the Afrika Korps through sheer weight of men and metal. But even in defeat, Rommel's reputation remained untarnished. He had been outgunned, not outthought. His withdrawal from Egypt into Libya, then into Tunisia, had been conducted with such skill that even his enemies spoke of it with admiration. And then the Americans arrived. The men of the 1st Armored Division who landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 were untested, inexperienced, and equipped with tanks that Rommel's veterans considered target practice. Their commanders had studied warfare in textbooks and training grounds, but had never faced an enemy who fought without regard for the textbook. They moved in predictable columns, concentrated their forces in obvious locations, and telegraphed their intentions days before executing them. Rommel watched this new enemy with the clinical interest of a professor evaluating promising but naive students. The Americans had courage, that much was evident from the intelligence reports, but courage without experience was merely an invitation to slaughter. Their equipment was impressive in quantity, their supply lines seemingly infinite, but their tactical doctrine belonged to the previous war. They fought as if the desert were Belgium, as if position mattered more than movement, as if the lessons of North Africa had never been written. In January 1943, Rommel decided to provide them with an education. The offensive that became known as the Battle of Kasserine Pass was designed as a masterclass in desert warfare. Rommel identified the weakest point in the American-British Turkish line, a series of mountain passes in western Tunisia held primarily by inexperienced American units. He concentrated his armor in unexpected locations, struck with overwhelming force at the moment of maximum confusion, and exploited the breakthrough with the speed that had made him legendary. The Americans, caught completely unprepared, collapsed. For 5 days, the retreat became a rout. American units broke and scattered. Equipment was abandoned where entire battalions ceased to exist as organized fighting forces. German tank commanders reported American soldiers fleeing their positions before contact, officers unable to control their men, chaos spreading like wildfire through the Green troops who had never imagined war could be this fast, this brutal, this incomprehensible. Rommel's assessment of the American soldier, written in his diary during those February days, dripped with professional contempt. They were brave enough, he noted, but poorly led, poorly trained, and fighting with a doctrine that would have been obsolete in 1918. They had no conception of mobile warfare. They reacted instead of anticipating. They were, in his estimation, exactly what he had expected from a nation that had spent the last 20 years at peace, while Europe tore itself apart. The defeat at Kasserine Pass shocked the American military establishment. Eisenhower, commanding the Allied forces in North Africa, recognized immediately that something fundamental had to change. The problem wasn't equipment or supply. American industry was outproducing the Axis powers in every category. The problem was doctrine, leadership, and understanding. The Americans needed someone who could think like Rommel, move like Rommel, and beat Rommel at his own game. They needed George Patton. March 6, 1943, Guettar, Tunisia. The valley stretched out like an empty stage, bounded by rocky hills and scattered with the skeletal remains of dead trees. A German reconnaissance battalion moved through it carefully, scouts ranging ahead, the main column maintaining proper spacing. They had been told the Americans were somewhere to the east, probably dug in around the oasis town, waiting to be flanked and destroyed. Standard procedure: identify the American positions, report back, allow the armor to execute the envelopment. But something was different this time. The scouts reported movement on the ridges, not retreating Americans, but vehicles moving into position, artillery, tank destroyers, infantry companies entrenching on commanding ground. The reconnaissance commander halted his column and sent a coded message back to division headquarters. The Americans weren't where they were supposed to be. They were where the Germans were supposed to go. The attack came at dawn, but not from the direction anyone expected. American artillery, positioned overnight on heights the Germans had assumed were empty, opened fire with a precision that stunned veterans who had fought from Poland to Moscow. The barrage didn't target the German front line. It targeted the supply trucks, command vehicles, the assembly areas where reinforcements were gathering. Within minutes, the German advance transformed from an organized offensive into a scramble for cover, and then the American tanks appeared, not charging across open ground like they had at Kasserine, not bunched in defensive positions like sitting ducks. They came from the flanks, from the reverse slopes of hills, from positions that had been carefully scouted and prepared during the night. They fired and withdrew, struck and vanished, refused to remain stationary long enough to become targets. The German tank commanders, veterans of 2 years of desert warfare, found themselves fighting an enemy that moved like Rommel, because George Patton had spent 3 weeks studying every one of Rommel's battles. Patton arrived in North Africa with a reputation as a difficult, eccentric officer whose passion for military history bordered on obsession. He wore ivory-handled revolvers, wrote poetry, believed in reincarnation, and claimed to have fought in previous lives at battles from Cannae to Gettysburg. His superiors considered him brilliant but unstable, a man whose aggressive instincts needed to be carefully managed. Eisenhower gave him command of the São Corps with explicit instructions: restore discipline, rebuild confidence, and for God's sake, don't start any diplomatic incidents. Patton ignored the instructions about caution. He had read everything written about Rommel, every battle report, every intelligence summary, every captured document that mentioned the Desert Fox's hack. He studied Rommel's biography, his pre-war writings on armored warfare, even his personal habits and command style. While other American commanders focused on learning from their training or mistakes, Patton became a student of his enemy's successes. What he discovered was a philosophy that resonated with his own instinct. Rommel didn't fight battles. He orchestrated them. He understood that the psychological dimension of warfare mattered as much as the physical. An enemy who didn't know where you were, what you intended, or when you would strike was already half defeated before the first shot was fired. The key to desert warfare wasn't holding ground or accumulating victory. It was maintaining the initiative, keeping the enemy reactive, never allowing them to establish the tempo they preferred. Patton recognized in Rommel a kindred spirit, a commander who understood that war was motion and stasis was death. But he also recognized something Rommel might not have fully appreciated. The Americans had advantages that could transform Rommel's own tactics into weapons of overwhelming effectiveness. American industry could produce tanks, trucks, and ammunition at rates the Germans couldn't match. American air power was growing stronger every week. American logistics could support levels of operational tempo that would exhaust the Africa Corps. All All that was needed was to apply Rommel's methods with American resources. The transformation of II Corps happened with shocking speed. Patton imposed discipline through example and intimidation. Soldiers who weren't wearing helmets found themselves doing push-ups regardless of rank. Officers who showed hesitation were relieved immediately. Training exercises emphasized speed, aggression, and initiative at every level. Tank crews practiced shoot-and-scoot tactics until they could execute them in darkness. Infantry learned to move at night, to read terrain like a map, to understand that the ground itself was a weapon if used correctly. But the most important change was psychological. Patton didn't tell his soldiers to match the Germans. He told them they were going to beat the Germans using German methods perfected by American execution. He showed them maps of Rommel's battles and explained how each victory had been achieved through surprise, speed, and violence of action. Then he showed them how the same principles could be applied with better equipment, better supply, and better intelligence. The soldiers of II Corps began to believe they could win. At Guettar, Patton implemented a battle plan that could have been lifted from Rommel's playbook. He identified the terrain features that dominated the battlefield and occupied them first. He positioned his armor on reverse slopes where it couldn't be seen until the moment of engagement. He used artillery to disrupt German assembly areas before the attack could develop momentum. He kept reserves mobile and uncommitted until the decisive moment revealed itself. And when the Italian and German forces attacked, expecting the same confused, brittle defense they'd encountered at Kasserine, they walked into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. The battle lasted 3 days. The Germans and Italians threw everything they had at the American positions. Infantry assaults, tank attacks, artillery bombardments, the desperate, grinding combat that Rommel had used to break British defenses across 2 years of desert war. But the Americans didn't break. They absorbed the attacks, channeled them into kill zones, and counterattacked from unexpected directions. German tank commanders found themselves fighting blind, unable to locate American positions until shells were already tearing through their armor. On the third day, the Axis forces withdrew. It was the first clear American victory in North Africa. April 7, 1943. German headquarters, somewhere in Tunisia. Rommel sat in a command tent that smelled of cigarette smoke and old canvas, reading the latest intelligence summaries. The reports from Guettar troubled him more than the casualty figures suggested. The Americans hadn't simply held their ground. They had fought intelligently. The defensive positions had been well chosen. The counterattacks had been timed perfectly. The use of terrain and reserves had demonstrated a sophistication absent from previous engagements. Someone had been teaching the Americans, or someone had been studying him. The supplies on his desk told part of the story. Another shipment delayed, another convoy sunk in the Mediterranean, another request for reinforcements denied because there were no reinforcements to send. The Africa Corps was being strangled slowly by logistics, while the Americans seemed to have unlimited everything: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. The reports from captured American positions described supply dumps that would have sustained a German division for months. But what disturbed Rommel most wasn't the material advantage. It was the operational pattern. The Americans were starting to move like his own forces. Quick probes followed by rapid withdrawals, attacks from unexpected directions, refusal to remain predictable. The instinctive understanding that mobility was survival in the desert environment they were learning. One name kept appearing in the intelligence reports: Patton. Rommel knew the name. He had read the pre-war American military journals that published articles by promising officers. Patton had written about armored warfare, about the need for speed and aggression, about the psychological dimensions of combat. The writing had been competent but unremarkable. The standard theoretical musings of a peacetime officer who had never tested his theories against reality. But something had changed. The Patton commanding II Corps bore little resemblance to the theoretical armchair general. This Patton fought with an intuition that suggested either natural genius or careful study. His forces operated with a confidence that couldn't be explained by their brief combat experience. They moved as if following a doctrine that had been refined through years of desert warfare. They moved as if they had read the same playbook. Rommel made a note in his diary, a single sentence that captured his growing realization: the Americans have found a commander who understands. It was the closest he would ever come to acknowledging that someone had turned his own methods against him. The final offensive came in mid-April. By then, Rommel had already been recalled to Germany, his health broken by 2 years of desert warfare and his confidence shaken by the inevitable mathematics of a war Germany couldn't win. But the Africa Corps he left behind still fought with the skill and determination he had instilled in them. They executed defensive maneuvers that would have stopped any conventional attack, using the same terrain reading and mobile defense that had frustrated the British for so long. Patton's II Corps attacked from 3 directions actions simultaneously. The operation was vintage Rommel. Multiple axes of advance, constant pressure that prevented the defenders from concentrating their forces, exploitation of every penetration before the defense could reorganize. But it was executed with American efficiency. When a column encountered resistance, it didn't batter itself against the strong point. It bypassed it and continued advancing, leaving follow-up forces to contain the position. When German tanks counter-attacked, they found American tank destroyers already positioned in ambush. When the Afrika Korps attempted its trademark withdrawal to regroup, American aircraft and artillery caught them in the open. The Germans were being defeated with German tactics, perfected by American resources and applied with ruthless consistency. On April 19th, American forces linked up with Montgomery's 8th Army, cutting off the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia. The surrender came in early May. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity, the largest Axis surrender to that point in the war. Among the captured documents were planning maps and operational orders that revealed just how completely the Germans had misunderstood their enemy. Position after position had been abandoned because intelligence indicated American forces moving to encircle them. Movements that turned out to be feints designed to trigger exactly that response. Attack after attack had been channeled in carefully prepared kill zones by defenders who seemed to anticipate every move before it was made. The Germans had been fighting a ghost army commanded by someone who knew exactly how they thought, because Patton had learned to think like Rommel before learning to think better than Rommel. May 13, 1943, Tunis. In the captured German headquarters, American officers sorted through filing cabinets filled with operational documents. Maps covered every wall, annotated with the careful detail of professional soldiers who knew their craft. Supply inventories, unit rosters, intelligence summaries, the administrative debris of an army that had fought brilliantly and lost inevitably. One officer found Rommel's personal copy of a pre-war book on armored warfare. The margins were filled with handwritten notes, observations about terrain and timing, critiques of the author's assumptions. The officer flipped through it idly, then stopped when he reached the author's name on the title page. Major George S. Patton, Jr., United States Army. The book had been published in 1933, a theoretical exploration of how tanks might be employed in future conflicts. Rommel had owned a copy for a decade, had studied it carefully enough to fill the margins with comments, had perhaps learned something from the American officer's analysis of speed and mobility, and then Patton had learned from Rommel's application of those same principles. The war had become a conversation between two men who had never met but understood each other perfectly. What Rommel said when he realized Patton was using his own tactics against him was never recorded in any official document. The Desert Fox was already in Germany when the final collapse came in Tunisia, watching from a distance as the methods he had perfected were turned into instruments of his army's destruction. His diary entries from that period are terse, clinical, focused on the broader strategic situation rather than the tactical humiliation of being outmaneuvered by a former student. But his silence on the subject speaks volumes. For a commander whose entire reputation rested on tactical innovation and unpredictability, there was perhaps nothing more devastating than becoming predictable. The techniques that had made him legendary, the rapid flanking movements, the appearance in unexpected locations, the psychological warfare of keeping the enemy guessing, all of these had been cataloged, studied, understood, and replicated. The desert had stopped being his private battlefield and become a shared space where his opponents knew the terrain as well as he did. This was the ultimate reversal. Rommel had spent 2 years teaching the British that conventional warfare was suicide in North Africa. The British had eventually learned the lesson, but by then, Rommel was fighting not just against British Army, but against American resources, and the Americans, with typical directness, had simply hired a teacher who learned faster than Rommel's previous students. Patton didn't reinvent desert warfare. He didn't develop revolutionary new tactics or introduce game-changing weapons. He simply took everything Rommel had proven successful and executed it with better logistics, better intelligence, better air support, and the confidence of a commander who knew he was using a proven playbook. The irony was precise, elegant. The Desert Fox was outfoxed by a man using the Desert Fox's own manual. In the German military academies, Rommel's North African campaigns would be studied for decades as examples of operational excellence against superior forces. Students would analyze his movements at Tobruk and Gazala, his masterful retreat from El Alamein, his tactical brilliance at Kasserine Pass. They would learn about reading terrain, maintaining tempo, and the importance of keeping the enemy off balance. They would also learn about El Guettar, where every one of those principles was turned against their creator, the compass in the sand. Throughout the campaign, American soldiers noticed a peculiar pattern in the abandoned German positions. Among the scattered equipment and empty ammunition boxes, they frequently found compasses, not damaged or destroyed, but carefully placed, sometimes arranged in small clusters, oriented toward specific directions. Intelligence officers initially suspected some kind of signaling system, but the pattern made no sense for communication. Eventually, someone realized these were navigational tools left behind during rapid withdrawals, the same compasses that had guided Rommel's forces across thousands of miles miles, a featureless desert. The Africa Corps had been famous for their ability to navigate by dead reckoning, to move confidently through terrain where other armies became hopelessly lost. The compass became a symbol of that confidence, the tool that enabled the speed and surprise that made Rommel dangerous. But in the final weeks of the Tunisia campaign, the compasses were abandoned faster than they could be collected, not because the Germans were retreating in panic, but because navigation had become irrelevant. Every direction led to the same destination: Allied encirclement. The desert that had been Rommel's ally, that had swallowed his enemies and hidden his movements, had become a cage. The Americans left the compasses where they found them. They had their own navigation now, their own understanding of how to move through this landscape. They had learned from the master, absorbed the lessons, and then improved upon them with the methodical efficiency that characterized the American approach to war. The compasses in the sand were relics of a teaching that had worked too well, philosophy that had been passed from teacher to student and then perfected until the student surpassed the master. After the war, someone asked Patton if he had ever met Rommel. He said no, but that he had read everything the German commander had written and studied every battle he had fought. When pressed to explain how he had beaten Rommel's tactics, Patton offered a characteristically blunt assessment. I didn't beat his tactic. I used his tactic. The difference was that I had more tanks, more fuel, and more time to practice. It was a humble answer from a man not known for humility, but it contained a profound truth about warfare in the modern age. The genius of innovation matters less than the resources to implement innovation at scale. Rommel had proven that mobile warfare could dominate the desert environment. Patton had proven that mobile warfare, backed by industrial might, was unstoppable. The Desert Fox had written the textbook. The Americans had simply printed more copies. Epilogue: the mirror. In the end, what happened in North Africa was not simply a military defeat or a tactical reversal. It was a demonstration of how quickly warfare evolves when both sides are led by commanders willing to learn from each other. Rommel taught the Allies that speed and deception could defeat superior numbers. Patton taught the Germans that speed and deception backed by unlimited resources could defeat superior skill. The irony is that both men were students of military history, believers in the idea that past battles contained lessons applicable to future conflict. Both had studied Alexander and Napoleon, Frederick and Grant. Both understood that war was as much an intellectual exercise as a physical contest, and both arrived at similar conclusions about how armor should be employed in open terrain. The only difference was timing and geography. Rommel had the opportunity to test his theories first against enemies who were still learning the rules of mechanized warfare. By the time Patton arrived in North Africa, the rules were already established. All he had to do was play the game better than the man who had written the rules. Somewhere in a box of captured German documents, American archivists later found a photograph. It showed Rommel standing next to a Panzer III in the Libyan desert, squinting into the sun, a pair of captured British binoculars hanging from his neck. On the back, someone had written a date: June 1942, after the fall of Tobruk, when the Africa Corps was at the peak of its power and the road to Cairo seemed open. The photograph ended up in Patton's personal files, though no one knows how he acquired it. Perhaps he took it from the captured headquarters as a souvenir. Perhaps it was given to him by an intelligence officer who thought he might find it interesting. Perhaps Patton requested it specifically, wanting a physical image of the commander whose methods he had studied so carefully. Whatever the reason, the photograph remained in Patton's possession for the rest of the war. On the back, in Patton's distinctive handwriting, someone later found a single sentence added below the original date: a worthy teacher. It was the closest either man came to acknowledging the strange relationship that had developed between them, a relationship conducted entirely through battle, mediated by tactics and terrain. Never spoken, but deeply understood. They were opponents who shared a language, enemies who respected each other's fluency in the grammar of mobile warfare. In the desert outside Tunis, the wind eventually buried the abandoned compasses under drifts of sand. The tank tracks faded, the shell craters smoothed over. The physical evidence of the campaign disappeared into the landscape that had witnessed it, but the lessons remained, encoded in doctrine and training manuals, passed from one generation of officers to the next. Rommel's tactics became standard curriculum at military academies across the world. Officers studied his campaigns not as examples of what to avoid, but as demonstrations of what was possible with imagination and boldness. And alongside Rommel's battles, they studied Patton's North African campaign, not as a defeat of Rommel's methods, but as their ultimate validation and perfection. The student had honored the teacher by learning the lessons so well that he could improve upon them, and the teacher, though he never spoke of it directly, had honored the student by recognizing that the methods he pioneered had found their highest expression in the hands of an enemy who understood them completely. In the mirror of the desert sand, two commanders had seen each other clearly across the fog of war. What Rommel said when he realized Patton was using his own tactics against him was perhaps less important than what he must have thought, that he had taught the lesson too well, that his success had planted the seeds of his own defeat, and that in the end, the greatest compliment one warrior can pay another is to learn from them so thoroughly that the learning becomes indistinguishable from mastery. The compass always points north, but in the desert, north is wherever your enemy isn't expecting you to go. Rommel taught that truth. Patton proved it. And the war moved on, carrying their shared knowledge to other battlefields, other commanders, other moments when the student becomes the teacher and the cycle begins again. The sand remembers nothing, but the soldiers who fought there and the commanders who led them and the historians who studied what they accomplished, they remember everything. And what they remember most is not who won or who lost, but how completely two men from different nations, different languages, different ideologies came to understand each other through the universal language of warfare conducted with excellence. That understanding, born in the North African desert and tested in the crucible of total war, remains the most enduring legacy of their confrontation. Not victory, not defeat, but the recognition that in war, as in all human endeavors, the greatest achievements come when we learn from those who challenge us most completely. Rommel challenged the Allies to fight differently. Patton accepted the challenge and returned it perfected. And in that exchange, both men transcended their individual limitations and became something larger, symbols of the eternal conversation between innovation and adaptation, between teaching and learning, between the methods of war and the wisdom to know when those methods have been mastered by someone who understands them better than you do. The mirror in the sand reflected both their faces, and when the reflection became clearer than the original, the desert had taught its final lesson, that every teacher must eventually meet the student who surpasses them, and that this is not defeat but the highest honor one warrior can bestow upon another. The war moved west into Europe toward its inevitable conclusion, but in the desert, where the wind erased all evidence and the sand covered every trace, two commanders left behind something more permanent than victory or defeat. They left behind proof that excellence recognizes excellence, even across enemy lines, and that sometimes the greatest tribute to a warrior is not to mourn their defeat, but to celebrate how perfectly someone learned from their example. What Rommel said remains unrecorded, but what he taught echoes still in every military academy where officers study the art of mobile warfare, in every tank commander who learns to read terrain and exploit surprise, in every student of military history who recognizes that the greatest battles are fought not just with weapons, but with ideas. And the greatest idea of all is simple, that war is a conversation, and the most eloquent speakers are those who listen carefully to what their enemies are teaching them before crafting their reply. Patton listened, Rommel taught, the desert witnessed, and the lesson endured long after both men were gone, long after their armies had disbanded, long after the compasses buried in the sand had rusted into dust. Some lessons are written in books, others are written in blood and sand, and the most important are written in the recognition that passes between warriors who understand each other completely, even when understanding means accepting that you have been defeated by your own methods, perfected in the hands of someone who learned from you better than you learned from yourself. That is what Rommel never said, but surely understood. That is what Patton never claimed, but certainly knew. And that is what the desert preserved in the silence between battles, in the empty spaces on the map, in the places where two great commanders met through their tactics and recognized each other as equals. The mirror in the sand showed both their faces, and when history looked into that mirror, it saw not victory or defeat, but the eternal truth that excellence has no nationality, that brilliance transcends border, and that the greatest honor a warrior can receive is to have their methods mastered by an opponent worthy of the challenge. The compasses pointed north, but the lesson pointed beyond victory, beyond defeat, toward the understanding that war is ultimately about who learns faster, adapts better, and applies the lessons with greater resources and determination. Rommel learned from history, Patton learned from Rommel, and the world learned from both of them that in the desert of war, the only direction that matters is the one your enemy hasn't anticipated, until the day comes when your enemy anticipates everything, because they have become a perfect mirror of your own tactical genius. On that day, the war is no longer about innovation. It becomes about execution, and the side with more fuel, more tanks, and more time to practice will always win. That was the final lesson of North Africa. Rommel wrote it in his victories. Patton read it in his defeats. And together, without ever meeting, without ever speaking, they created a masterclass in how warfare evolves. Not through revolution, but through the patient application of proven methods backed by overwhelming resources. The desert has forgotten them now, but the lessons remain, carved not into stone, but into the doctrine of every modern army, the training of every tank commander, the understanding of every officer who studies military history and recognizes the greatest teachers are sometimes our enemy, and the greatest students are sometimes ourselves. What Rommel said when Patton used his own desert tactics against him was nothing. Silence was the only possible response when faced with a mirror that reflected your methods perfected beyond your own ability to execute them. But in that silence, if we listen carefully, we can hear the grudging respect of one master recognizing another. And that recognition, born in the heat and dust and violence of the North African desert, remains the most eloquent statement either man could have made about the other. The compass always points north. But in the desert, wisdom points toward the understanding that every victory contains the seeds of future defeat, and every defeat contains the lessons for future victory. Rommel and Patton proved both halves of that equation. And in doing so, they proved something larger. That war is not about winning or losing, but about learning fast enough to survive the next battle. The sand remembers nothing, but we remember them. And in remembering Remembering, we honor not their victories or defeats, but their willingness to learn from each other across the vast distance of enmity and conflict. That is the final truth the desert taught, that excellence recognizes excellence, even in an enemy, especially in an enemy, because only an enemy can show us the limits of our methods and force us to transcend them. Rommel showed Patton those limits. Patton transcended them, and together, without meaning to, they wrote the definitive textbook on modern mobile warfare. The compass is buried now, lost under years of sand and wind and the relentless passage of time, but the direction it pointed toward remains clear, toward the understanding that every teacher must eventually meet the student who learns their lessons too well, and that this meeting is not tragedy, but triumph. The triumph of ideas over individuals, of methods over men, of the eternal truth that excellence is not owned but shared, not hoarded but taught, not defeated but perfected by those willing to learn from it completely. What Rommel said is lost to history, but what he taught endures, and in the end, that is the only epitaph any teacher needs, that their lessons outlive them, taught to students they never met, perfected by enemies they never defeated, honored by a world that learned from both victor and vanquished, that the greatest battles are won, not with weapons alone, but with the wisdom to recognize when your opponent has become your equal by learning from your example. The mirror in the sand showed both their faces, indistinguishable in the reflection, united by the understanding that war is conversation and excellence is the only language that matters. And in that silent conversation, conducted across battlefields and decades, Rommel and Patton achieved something greater than victory. They achieved immortality in the methods they pioneered and the students they taught, whether they knew they were teaching or not. The lesson endures. The desert forgets. And somewhere between memory and sand, two warriors remain forever locked in their dance. Teacher and student, mirror images of tactical brilliance, proof that excellence transcends nationality, and that the greatest compliment one warrior can pay another is to learn from them so completely that the learning becomes indistinguishable from perfection. That is what Rommel never said, but surely knew. That is what Patton demonstrated without blaming, and that is what the desert preserved in the spaces between the compasses, in the silence after the guns, in the understanding that passes between warriors when words fail, but respect endures. The mirror showed both their faces. History records both their names, and we remember both their lessons, not as victors or vanquished, but as teachers whose classroom was the desert and whose final exam was written in the shared understanding that excellence has no enemies, only students willing to learn, and in the end, they both passed with honors.